Hola a todos, soy Alfonso Goizueta y os doy la bienvenida al podcast de la revista Política Exterior, un espacio donde conversamos para entender mejor el mundo que nos rodea. Este es un episodio muy especial, es el primero que grabamos en vídeo y es el primero en el que nos movemos del estudio. Tenemos la suerte de que nos acoge el Instituto de Empresa en Madrid para hablar con Manuel Muñiz, rector del Instituto de Empresa. Bienvenido.
Muchas gracias.
Y con doctor Enrico Letta, decano de la School of Politics, Economics and Global Affairs. Bienvenido también.
Gracias.
Manuel Muñiz es profesor en Relaciones Internacionales, fue secretario de Estado de España Global en el Ministerio de Asuntos Exteriores entre 2020 y 2021. Y el doctor Enrico Letta fue primer ministro de Italia desde 2013 a 2014, secretario nacional del Partido Democrático de marzo de 2021 a febrero de 2023. Ambos han desempeñado un papel fundamental en la configuración política europea moderna. Y ahora vamos a pasar al inglés para tener esta conversación con ellos. Welcome both. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for joining the show.
Sure.
Política Exterior Podcast is so happy to be here at the Instituto de Empresa with two great guests such as yourselves. And I think it's very valuable because you've both been in policy making and now you are on the realm of academia. So I think we can get a great impression of what it means to be in a multipolar world, or what it means for Europe to be in a multipolar world. Both of you have dedicated your careers in policy making to fostering a stronger, more united Europe. And I think this is especially interesting to discuss in this dog-eat-dog world in which we're living. No? Mm-hmm. So the first question I would like to pose to the both of you, merely to set the scene, is what are the main threats that the European Union is facing today in this multipolar world?
I should say, though, that my public service career was much shorter than Enrico's. Enrico suffers from this sort of recidivism. He keeps on going back to politics, which is a vice, you know. So I mean, I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for coming and for having us here. And it's wonderful for IE to be able to host this conversation, and it's a privilege always to share the time and the conversation with Enrico. So on threats. It's a big question, right? So I think what might be useful is to produce a depiction, an assessment of where the international system is headed, because that's the backdrop to which Europe and the European debate within which it occurs. And I have a feeling that I have a sense and interpretation that we're moving into a space that is characterized at least by two big features. One is a tendency towards fracture. So we're living through a fracturing of the international system. We've lived through a period of very rapid buildup of interdependence, so very rapid globalization. And this has manifested itself across areas and fields in economics, in politics, in security defense, in the multilateral space. And this process of growing interdependence is being reversed. So we're seeing a fracturing in trade, for example, through tariffs, the weakening of the WTO, and others. We're seeing a fracturing in the political space, the weakening of alliances, more ready use of force around the world and others. And we're seeing a fracturing in the multilateral space. So as we speak, the UN is being defunded. Countries are leaving UN agencies and others, most significantly the US, but also others. And So there's this new environment that Europe needs to live in. And I think this is to some extent a threat to core European interests and values. The European Union was founded on the notion of integration and managing interdependence, and this international environment poses a threat to our economic, political, and values agendas. And then the second trend, and I'll finish on this, I don't want this to be too long, is sort of one of an America that is moving to a post-hegemonic period. So since the end of the Cold War to right around the second Trump administration, the U.S. consistently deployed what could be called a hegemonic foreign policy. And this entailed forward presence through bases and allies and alliances, militarily, taking care of major dossiers in the diplomatic space. So those of us that live on a plane, and Enrico has done this for a number of years, and you go around the world, you come to realize how important America is in the Indo-Pacific, in the Straits of Taiwan, in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, and the Baltic. It's in the Arctic. I mean, and this has put an enormous strain on America's resources. And if there's one thing that characterizes the current administration in the U.S., and that will probably survive the current administration in the U.S., because this goes beyond Trump, is this idea that phase is over, and the U.S. is going to, in fact, be much more concentrated on its hemisphere, the homeland defense. So this withdrawal, despite it being sort of wrapped around this language of masculinity and strength and American exceptionalism and all that. It's actually, if you look at the facts, it's actually a process of withdrawal and containment of U.S. presence abroad. And this also has big implications for Europe. So I'm not sure, this is about the weakening of NATO, withdrawal of U.S. forces and presence in Europe, greater burden sharing, and many others. So I'm not sure if these are strictly threats, but they're clearly the backdrop to this conversation. And Europe will need to make big decisions as to what it wants to do, given these, at least these two big macro trends that are shaping the international environment.
I think the period 22-24 changed completely the way in which the European Union is in the world, because we had in 22 the Russian invasion to Ukraine, in 24 the arrival of Trump 2, that is totally different from Trump 1, and we suddenly understood that we were at the end of the period that I would name the period of the happy dependencies. Europe was happy to be dependent. We were dependent on energy, on the Russians. We were depending on the industrial basis on the Chinese, and were dependent on both security and tech on the Americans. And suddenly we understand and we realized in this period that these dependencies were becoming the coffin of the European competitiveness and the European autonomy. And suddenly in 25 and today, we are trying to reverse, and it's not easy to reverse. It's not easy because these dependencies were very happy because they were very cheap, all very cheap. Being dependent on the Americans on security made some countries very, very happy. Countries like Italy, Spain, spending very few money to get secured by the Americans. And the same on energy, countries like Italy or Germany, Austria, with the Russian gas and the Russian oil, very cheap. The same with the relationship with China. So now the big topic is that we woke up and we understood that we have to change. And the topic is to be very fast in this change, being more integrated and more independent.
Going a bit deeper into the strategy by which Europe has to change or put a forceful end to this era of dependencies, your 2024 report to the Commission, very much a grand strategy for the continent, was titled Much More Than a Market, Speed, Security and Solidarity. I would like to go a bit deeper into these three elements, because how can Europe's internal market become a geopolitical tool in this new world?
It is for a very simple reason, because when we created the single market in the period 85-92, we integrated all the single market, but three main subjects: energy, connectivity, and financial markets. Because at that time, the big European countries were big enough to be competitive at world level, standing alone on these fields. And at the same time, we had a single market limited to the four freedoms: freedom of movement of goods, services, capitals, and people. And we missed the fifth freedom. This is what we need today. The fifth freedom is innovation, knowledge, skills, I would say the intangible. And the intangible is the reason of the big success of the US economy and the big success of Chinese investment on AI and the big unsuccess of Europe in the last years. So what we did in the 90s was good, but it was done for a world that is different from the world of today. The world of today is a world of giants. These giants were not there. In the 90s, we didn't have China and India. We had them, but not as economic giants. I always say that China and India together in that period were economically as big as Italy. Today, they are 20 times Italy. So the true mission today is how to recuperate these 35 years of fragmentation. It's too late, maybe, but we have only an exit strategy. And the only exit strategy is to try to integrate and to be fast, integrating these three subjects, so energy, connectivity, and financial markets, getting as fast as possible an integrated energy union, connectivity and telecom union, and the savings and investments union, that is the way to integrate financial markets. To do so, there are some enablers. I named them the fifth freedom, the 28th regime for the regulatory simplification, and the freedom to stay. I think is the fundamental way for Europe to recover, to reverse this trend in the very, I would say, sad and bad decisions of the happy dependencies decades. I think it is feasible. It is feasible for the very simple reason that there are no alternatives. And all the different countries within Europe are aware of the pressure that we are having from abroad. But it is clear that if we waste time, if we rest, or if we wait for, Godot, and that will be, the decline will be for sure the future of Europe.
Can reform or die then?
Can I add something on this, because I think it's very important, and it connects the first and your next question. I'm quite convinced actually that we will look back in 5 years' time and assess how we have performed as Europeans and in Europe. And the assessment will be fundamental. And there are two paths ahead for Europe. I mean, you can complicate this analysis as much as you want. And being an academic institution, I can tell you can complicate it endlessly. But in reality, there are two paths. One is a stalling of the integration process, or at worst, in fact, a balkanization, a further fracturing of the European project, which is one of the paths that Europe could follow. And maybe we can discuss domestic politics in Europe in a little bit, but there are clearly political movements in Europe that are advocating for less integration rather than more integration. And then there is a path of integration that would see a deepening of the single market along the lines of what Enrico has mentioned. And there is a lot that we can do to remain relevant, to provide for space for growth and for innovation in Europe if we deepen integration. And by the way, there's now little excuse, because if you look at Enrico's report, I mean those are guidelines to what to do and to what to do within the current treaty. So it's really about political capital and willingness to push forward this agenda. And I hope deepening in the common security and defense policy of Europe, which is the other big pillar that we will need to really attain strategic autonomy. If we do not choose this second path, we are going to learn very quickly, and this will be the substance of this assessment I was mentioning at the beginning, what it means to be not an actor in international politics, but the object of international politics. And others will come and they will transact with our interests on trade, on investment, on economics, and they will transact with our values, and we will be relegated to spectators of international politics. And this is a reality Europe and Europeans have not endured in a very long time, centuries. But this is something that could happen to us if we do not take the right decisions. It reminds me a little bit, it's sort of like a China 1850s moment, where if the right decisions are not taken, we will condemn a number of generations of Europeans to this destiny of being the subjects of others' interests. And so I think the scale, the stakes are as high as this, and as we move forward. And I keep a tally with Enrico, and every now and then we check in to see what his assessment is on how is the process moving forward? What are we doing on the energy space? What are we doing on the telecoms? What are we doing on security and defense? But this is, the jury's out. I mean, this is what we're living through in Europe. It is of this import.
That's a very bleak historical analogy. I love it. China in the 1850s. Are we at the brink of a century of humiliation for Europe if we become an object of international politics?
I'll tell you something. If we decide, just to be more explicit, if Europeans decide in the next few years to put in power in our countries political movements that seek to unravel the European integration process, despite the fact, by the way, that many of these movements call themselves patriots, which I find it to be one of the most incredible contradictions in our political life, because there is nothing less patriotic than to convey to Europeans today that they're going to be more powerful, more sovereign if they go to international trade negotiations as the X number of citizens of Luxembourg, or as the little, few number of Portuguese citizens. These are tiny actors in international politics. But if this is what we choose in our domestic politics, I can tell you this is what awaits us. There is another vision, thankfully, and we have a whole set of people like Enrico and many others advocating for the different path that is, in fact, I think, much more patriotic and connected to this idea of forwarding European interests. So yes.
So you're becoming, let's say, a great power in the near future. What is the relation going to be with the United States, for example? Because the Munich Security Conference has just been held, even though the speech by Marco Rubio has been significantly different than the speech made by J.D. Vance last year. The Americans are still talking about the decline of the West being its main proponent, Europe. No? So what is our relationship with the Americans going to be after Trump? Is it strained forever? Is it Trumpianism going to persist in the United States in different forms?
Yeah, should I take the Trump? You go ahead. I still want to be able to go in and out of the U.S., so maybe I'll go after you.
I have to say that, in my view, the reaction to Trump has to be a reaction today at European level based on three main decisions. One, the first one, what we discussed before, the true completion of the integration of the single market, the transformation of the single market in one market. That is, in my view, the main brand of the future, first. Second, we need to open to the rest of the world. Mercosur, India, Australia, Indonesia, Mexico. These new trends in the trade agreements from the European side are the best response to crazy protectionism and tariff policy that Trump launched, and is the best way for Europe to be the global power as we are in a non-protectionistic way. Third, being able to protect Ukraine alone. Of course, we want the US with us protecting Ukraine, but if you take the figures on how the different countries helped Ukraine and stopped Russian aggression, I think the US is the 7th or the 8th country in the ranking. Germany is the first. And I strongly advocate the fact that the main point for us is to being able to do so alone. Because if we are able to do so, we can say to the US, we are happy if you are on board, but you can't blackmail us on other topics, because we can assure our own security. And that is a big game changer for us. So my point is that jumping into the ring and boxing with Trump won't be the right solution, because I think we will lose. We will go at the same level of his attitude. But at the same time, reacting on these three aspects can be the way to keep the relationship, because the transatlantic relationship has to stay, but at the same time being proud of our strength and being able to survive to this aggression.
On this issue, so I think there are two layers to this. So one is much more structural. So this idea of a post-hegemonic America has enormous implications for Europe, and it will entail disconnecting ourselves from this immense dependency on the US. Mostly on the security and defense front, but not exclusively on some other capabilities. Enrico mentioned technology and many others. And I think the strategic autonomy debate will grow in intensity, and we will need to address this. And this, as I was saying before, will probably survive Trump. I think Biden was probably the oldest of the last of a generation of Americans that either lived or have very vivid recollections of the Second World War, the Cold War, and the core of the transatlantic period during the Cold War. But Trump belongs to a completely different crowd, and I don't think even a change in administration would shift America back to this idea. For Europe, by the way, on security and defense, just so that for folks following this, I mean, NATO Article 5 commitment basically commits America to the continental defense of Europe. People forget, I mean, this is the commitment, and it's taken, the US currently has somewhere near 100,000 troops permanently deployed in European territory. So this is, to some extent, I mean, it is a real oddity. It is a real oddity in historical terms that an actor like this, 4,000 miles away from here, would play such a role. So I think that will be gone, and Europe needs to grapple with this, and we need to develop our capacities. There is something specific to the Trump administration, which I don't think will survive, which is this insidiousness, this heavy criticism of the European integration process. I don't see that on the other side of the aisle. This idea that the European integration process is a problem, that what you really need is these nationalist parties to come to power in Europe, mostly because of an immigration cultural policy issue that they've defended. In fact, Marco Rubio's speech at Munich, basically this is what it outlined. That's why it wasn't that different from J.D. Vance's from last year. And I think, I sincerely hope this will not stay. The reason is this is, in my mind, completely contrary to U.S. interests. So the Americans at the moment, they're pushing Europeans to do more on their own, including through direct pressure on our defense spending. To the point, just to give you a figure on this, Germany will be spending about 200 billion euros a year in defense by the end of this decade. And at the same time, they seem to be pushing and supporting far-right parties that are, in many instances, very Eurosceptic. So how does that Europe look for America? Populated by nationalist parties with immense defense spending and imbalances within European spending. That German defense spending, by the way, will be double the French defense spend by the end of the decade, which, if done exclusively outside of an EU framework, can pose real challenges on governance for Europeans and for Americans. So I think that something will have to give. I don't think the autonomy debate in Europe will give. I don't think America's willingness to focus on its hemisphere and homeland defense will give. I think the anti-EU rhetoric is what might change in future administrations.
How do we make a balance between the greater necessity for integration within Europe and the necessity of Europe opening to other regions of the world, as Dr. Letta said, with the growing populist nationalistic sentiment within Europe? Because it seems as if we pursue one path, we might be going back on the other one, no?
In reality, this is two parts of the same big mission, and the European Union is the most successful multilateral example and exercise in the world. And we are successful at the European Union because we are open within the European Union, no borders. We are the demonstrations of the fact of a no-border policy works, and works not only in terms of economic results, but in terms also of sentiment of the people. People are happy without borders within the European Union. If you speak with the Irish, they have every day they cross the border to have a trip for another European Union country, they have to pass a border because of is the consequence of Brexit. You go to Ireland, you have to have queues for passport, and the same for the Irish coming in the other countries. So it's a demonstration that borders are not something positive; they are negative, and people know very well that at the end of the day, living without borders is absolutely better. And this is why this sentiment we have internally has to be the sentiment with which we work externally in an opening mood, knowing that our economy needs openness. We are not a protectionistic set of countries. We need openness, and our economic DNA is exactly that, is organized to be successful in openness. This is why today we have stopped this crazy protectionism, and we have to work on a more open approach.
Yeah, I think we also have to be frank, and we have to be very explicit with people about the benefits of integration and the dangers of disintegration and of fracturing. I think Brexit is a very good example of this. Brexit carries and would always carry, this was explicitly conveyed, immense costs for the UK on a whole range of fronts. People forget when the UK joined the EU, it applied a number of times to join the European communities. At the time, it was blocked, vetoed by France a number of times. That moment in the 70s, that was preceded by decades of underperformance of the UK, economic performance of the UK compared to continental Europe. They had trade diversion, investment diversion, competitiveness issues. We know, that it is very painful for you to be left outside an entity of this scale, more so in this geopolitical environment. So I think we need to make the case strongly and clearly for the benefits of integration and point to the dangers of disintegration. And that rests on people like Enrico and our academic institutions and others, and then hope that European citizens understand that this is the case and that this shapes political outcomes in Europe. But the tension you have outlined, for me, is the core tension, because it then produces this split in the road that I mentioned before. How are our domestic politics going to evolve in the next few years is going to be key.
I wouldn't want to end this episode without talking about the elephant in the room, which is Russia. What is the future of our relationship with Russia going to be? At the end of the day, the war in Ukraine will one day end, and Russia will not disappear. Russia will remain there. So, what is going to be the future of our what should be our relationship with Russia in the future? Because there's a risk of going into a new appeasement of Russia, or a confrontation with her.
Mm-hmm. Well, my first sort of intuition is that a large chunk of the answer to that question will be provided by Russia itself, because one would need to assess Russian behavior in order to then respond to it. If Russian behavior continues to be that of outright violation of international law regarding its neighbors, their territorial integrity, their sovereignty, and others, it's going to be very problematic for Europe and for the European Union to have a constructive relationship with Russia when core member states of Europe are either threatened or feel directly attacked through hybrid means and others by Russia. The same is true of Russian behavior in cyberspace. So we have a lot of knowledge now. I mean, at the beginning in 2014, 15, 16, we were quite ignorant about the threats in cyberspace. But now we know about the campaigns that are launched, both disinformation, election hacking, and others, from Russia, from Russian-controlled servers. They target liberal democracies and their institutions in very sophisticated ways. So that's also very revealing of how Russia sees the environment. So a lot of the answer to your question will lie on what the Russians do and how they behave moving forward. What is important, I think, for us is to be very consistent in the implementation of our values and to provide ourselves with the tools to be able to respond. I worry quite a bit about the substance of the peace that we sign with Russia. I think it can set very concerning precedents about the acquisition of territories through aggression, and others. So both the nature of that peace settlement and Russian behavior moving forward will define that answer. I don't think there's any inherent hostility towards Russia in Europe, or for that matter, in NATO. I mean, I still remember the debates in the 90s about strengthening relations with Russia, maybe eventually having Russia affiliated in some capacity to the European project. There was a NATO-Russia council that was very active. So things began to turn south when aggression began to happen in Russia's borders.
I totally agree with what Manu just said, and I add the fact that it would be very complicated for Europe to set up, I would say, long-term peace settlement, knowing that the US are working on a direction that is not exactly the same, because the feeling that the same direction should be important for us, the Europeans, to be stronger in the negotiations, but it's not there. So my point is that Russia will stay, but I don't think that it will be easy to reverse what happened in the last 4 years. What happened in all the different fields, in universities, in the business, in sports, in every corner of life, relationships. Russia was banned from our lives, and it was banned because of what they did. What they did was horrible, and frankly speaking, I'm very sad for the Russian people, because at the end of the day, they are the victims. The Russian families that send their kids dying in Donbass, again, like it happened in in all the last century. Kids dying to move a border 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers, and families crying because of their kids dying because of that. The European Union was created exactly to say stop to this barbarian attitude that was the typical European attitude for centuries and centuries. To say borders are places to cooperate, not to die. And I think we have all to be said for Russian families and Russian people, because they were obliged to live again in this horrible past. We are the future, and we want to bring them into the future.
Can I add just something real quick? So the war has undone, in essence, 30 years of growing interdependence, 20-odd years of growing interdependence between Russia and Europe. I mean, that is the essence. We've broken our relations on the energy, infrastructure, security, education, culture areas. So it's going to take a long time to come anywhere near the level of relationship that we had before. I mean, the conflict will have a very long tail, right? But I also want to add a point here, which is in every one of these issues that we are discussing, on the Europe-US relation, on the Russia relation, on the question keeps on coming back to Europe and what Europe we want to build. And I keep on traveling around the world. I have to tell you, I hop on a plane and I go to Japan or I go to Canada, and I always think that we're getting the shorter end, the Europeans, the shorter end of the emerging international system, right? So I'm always there, with a bit of a sort of like a victim attitude, we have to manage our disentanglement from the Americans. We have the threat from the Russians. We have this economic dependency on trade, so Europe is fragile. And what I find is I speak to the Japanese and they tell me, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? You guys, you have a single market of hundreds of millions of consumers. You have a very sophisticated company and economic structure that allows you to be competitive globally. You have an institutional architecture in Europe that allows you to design and think of the future in ways that Enrico has outlined. You have a defense capacity that if you spend, I don't know if it's 3 or 5%, but whatever. I mean, if you attain the capabilities that NATO itself has now outlined, the capability plans, you would be able to contain Russia quite comfortably. And you come and talk to us about your challenges, and the Japanese tell you, we have 3 nuclear neighbors, the Russians, the North Koreans, the Chinese, all of them hostile to us. We have no ally nearby. The closest is South Korea, and then it's Australia, which is thousands of miles away. And America, that is to some extent retreating. Not even spending 10% of our GDP in defense will we be able to contain these threats. And then I go to Canada, and the Canadians tell me, are you kidding us? We have an absolute dependency on trade, on security, on defense, on the Americans. And we're thousands of miles away from any major ally compared to you guys. The Canadians, I was struck by this statistic when I was there. They have 70-odd gas and oil pipelines. All of them go south to the U.S. 0 go to ports for export. Can you imagine? Canada is one of the largest producers of oil and gas in the world. But they're entirely intertwined with the Americans, right? So they look at us and they say, look, you Europeans, you guys, you have to stop crying, right? You have to get your act together. You have to build a vision for Europe. But Europe is the continent that is better poised to navigate this environment, better than anybody else. We just need to get this agenda and this political thrust, in place for us to move forward. So I guess that's a positive message that our future is in our hands. And we have to be aware that others that are on the borders of the system, in the areas where this fracturing and this American retrenchment will be felt the strongest, some of them, they don't have that. They don't have that capacity, or it's much harder for them, right?
Europe is the best one poised for this challenge. I like that optimistic note to close the podcast. Thank you very much to both of you, Dr. Muñiz, Dr. Letta, for being here in the show with me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, y para más información y análisis de la política internacional no dejéis de consultar nuestra web politicaexterior.com. Nos vemos en el siguiente episodio.